Hello, friends, and welcome back. I'm glad you're here today. You know, one of the hardest things about perennial gardening isn't planting, it isn't watering, and it isn't even dealing with weeds. It's waiting. Because sometimes we plant something with high hopes, only to watch it sit there for an entire season looking small, unimpressive, and honestly, a little disappointing. And after a while, it's easy to start wondering if we made the wrong choice. Should we move it? Replace it? Give up on it completely? From my experience, that's exactly where many gardeners make a mistake. Not because they're doing something wrong, but because some of the best perennials simply take longer to reveal what they're capable of becoming. Many spend their early years building roots, establishing themselves underground, preparing for growth we can't yet see. And while that can be frustrating in the moment, it often leads to something remarkable later on. Today, we're going to look at 15 perennials that are absolutely worth waiting for. These are plants that may seem ordinary in the beginning, but often become some of the most beautiful, dependable, and rewarding parts of a mature garden. We'll also talk about why this happens, what signs to look for, and how to avoid giving up on a good plant too soon. So, if you've ever looked at a perennial and thought, maybe this plant just isn't worth it, this conversation may change the way you see your garden. Let's begin. One of the most surprising things about perennial gardening is how often healthy plants can look disappointing in the beginning. If you're new to growing perennials, this can feel incredibly confusing. You bring home a beautiful plant from the garden center, you prepare the soil, you water carefully, you follow the instructions, and then months later, the plant still looks small, sparse, and far less impressive than you expected. At that point, many gardeners start assuming something has gone wrong. Maybe the soil isn't right. Maybe the plant isn't happy. Maybe it was a bad purchase from the beginning. But in many cases, none of those things are true. In fact, some of the healthiest perennials in a garden can also be some of the least impressive during their first year or two. This is something that took me a while to understand, because when we buy plants, we're usually seeing them at their best. They're growing in ideal nursery conditions. They're carefully watered, carefully fertilized, and often displayed at the exact moment they're most attractive. But once they move into a real garden, their priorities begin to change. Many perennials stop focusing on flowers for a while. Instead, they begin investing energy somewhere we can't easily see, into roots, into stability, into long-term survival. And unfortunately, roots don't create the kind of excitement that flowers do. So from the gardener's perspective, it can look like very little is happening. I think this is where patience becomes difficult. Because modern gardening culture often celebrates quick results, instant color, fast growth, immediate transformation. But many of the most reliable perennial gardens were never built that way. They were built slowly, season by season, year by year. I've seen gardeners remove perfectly healthy plants simply because they expected too much too soon, not because the plants failed, but because the timeline was misunderstood. The perennial wasn't struggling, it was still establishing itself, and those are two very different situations. As we move through today's list, you'll notice a pattern. Many of these plants have something in common. Their best years often arrive much later than people expect. And once you understand that, it's much easier to appreciate what they're quietly doing in the early stages. Because sometimes, a small perennial isn't a disappointing plant. It's simply a future success story that hasn't revealed itself yet. One reason so many gardeners become frustrated with young perennials is that most of the important work happens where we can't see it, underground. When a perennial is first planted, it often has a simple goal. Not bigger flowers, not faster growth, but survival. The plant needs to establish roots that can support years of future growth. From above the soil, this process can look disappointing. The leaves may stay small, the stems may not get much taller, and flowering can be limited. But underground, something very different may be happening. Roots are exploring new soil, searching for moisture, building stability, and creating the foundation for future growth. In many home gardens, the first year is often more about root development than visible beauty. That's one reason some perennials seem to suddenly take off in their second or third year. The growth wasn't actually sudden. Much of the work was already happening beneath the surface. We simply couldn't see it. I remember being surprised by this when I first started gardening. A perennial would appear almost unchanged for an entire season. Then the following year, it would double in size. At first, it felt mysterious. Now I understand that the plant had been investing in roots all along. This is also why moving a perennial too often can create problems. Every time roots are disturbed, the plant may need to spend energy rebuilding underground systems again, and that can delay the progress we're hoping to see above ground. Of course, not every slow-growing plant is healthy. Poor soil, poor drainage, wrong sunlight. Those things still matter. But slow growth alone is not always a warning sign. Sometimes it's simply part of the process. And understanding that process can make gardening feel much less frustrating. Before we move to our first featured perennial, it's helpful to remember this. A plant that appears quiet above the soil may be working very hard below it. And in perennial gardening, that invisible work often becomes the visible beauty we enjoy years later. If there were ever a perennial that perfectly represented patience, it would probably be the peony. Few plants teach this lesson more clearly, because when peonies are young, they can be surprisingly unimpressive. The plant may remain small, flowering may be limited, and some years, a newly planted peony may not bloom at all. For gardeners who are used to quick results, that can feel discouraging. After all, peonies are famous for their large, beautiful flowers. When people buy one, they naturally expect a spectacular display. But peonies rarely work on our schedule. They work on theirs. During the first few years, much of a peony's energy goes toward building a strong root system and establishing itself in one location. And unlike many annual flowers, peonies generally dislike being moved. Once planted, they prefer stability, time, and patience. This is one reason experienced gardeners often choose a peony's location very carefully, not just for this season, but for the next 10, 20, or even 30 years. Because a mature peony can remain in the same spot for decades, and many do. What makes peonies so rewarding is the transformation that happens over time. The stems become stronger, the plant becomes fuller, blooming becomes more reliable, and each year often feels a little better than the one before. A young peony may produce only a few flowers. A mature peony can become one of the most impressive sights in the entire garden. I've noticed that older peony gardens often have a different feeling, too. Not flashy, not dramatic, just established. Like they've become part of the landscape itself. And perhaps that's part of their appeal. They're not temporary beauty, they're long-term beauty. Of course, peonies still need suitable conditions: good drainage, adequate sunlight, and a planting depth that isn't too deep. But once those needs are met, the biggest requirement is often patience. And that's not always easy, especially in the beginning. But if you can resist the urge to move them, divide them too early, or give up on them too soon, a peony often becomes one of the most rewarding plants you'll ever grow. And that's exactly why it earns the first place on today's list. If peonies teach patience through flowers, hostas teach patience through presence. Because when many gardeners first plant a hosta, it rarely looks remarkable. A few leaves, a small clump, sometimes barely noticeable among the surrounding plants. In fact, one of the easiest mistakes to make with hostas is underestimating them. A young hosta may occupy only a small section of a garden bed. It can seem almost insignificant, especially when compared to colorful annual flowers growing nearby. But hostas are not trying to make a quick impression. They're investing in the future. Year after year, something interesting begins to happen. The root system expands. The crown becomes larger. New shoots emerge more confidently each spring. And slowly, almost without noticing, the plant begins claiming more space. What once looked small and temporary starts becoming a major part of the garden. This transformation can be especially dramatic in shade gardens. Areas that once felt empty suddenly gain structure, texture, depth, and a sense of permanence. A mature hosta doesn't need bright flowers to attract attention. Its foliage does most of the work. Some hostas eventually become several feet wide. Their leaves create bold shapes that help organize the entire garden visually. And because many varieties return reliably year after year, they often become one of the most dependable plants in the landscape. That's one reason experienced gardeners frequently describe hostas as an investment. Not because they're expensive, but because their value grows over time. Of course, hostas are not perfect. Slugs can be a challenge, deer may find them attractive, and extremely dry conditions can create stress. But in suitable locations, hostas are remarkably forgiving. Once established, they often require surprisingly little effort. I think that's part of what makes hostas so satisfying. The change isn't dramatic overnight. It's gradual, steady, and lasting. Each year adds a little more size, a little more confidence, a little more presence, until one day you look at the garden and realize that one of the smallest plants you ever purchased has become one of the most important. And that's exactly the kind of perennial story we're talking about today. If there is one perennial that regularly tests a gardener's patience, it may be Baptisia. At first glance, a young Baptisia can seem surprisingly unimpressive. The plant grows slowly, the clump remains small, and compared to faster-growing perennials nearby, it may appear to be falling behind. But appearances can be deceiving, because while Baptisia often grows slowly above ground during its early years, something very important is happening below the surface. It is building one of the deepest and strongest root systems found among common garden perennials, and that changes everything later. In many ways, Baptisia behaves more like a long-lived shrub than a typical perennial. It isn't interested in quick growth. It isn't trying to fill space immediately. Instead, it focuses on creating a strong foundation first. And once that foundation is established, the plant begins revealing its true potential. A mature Baptisia can become surprisingly large. Its rounded shape creates structure. Its blue-green foliage adds texture. And in spring, its flower spikes can become one of the most attractive features in the garden. What once looked like a small, forgettable plant gradually becomes impossible to ignore. One reason experienced gardeners appreciate Baptisia so much is reliability. Once established, it handles drought remarkably well. It rarely asks for extra attention. And because of its deep roots, it often remains stable even during difficult growing conditions. That makes it particularly valuable in low-maintenance gardens. Of course, this long-term strength comes with a trade-off: patience. A newly planted Baptisia may need several years before it reaches its full presence, and during that time, many gardeners are tempted to move it. But that's usually not a good idea, because those deep roots that create future success also make mature plants difficult to transplant. That's why choosing the right location from the beginning matters so much. Give Baptisia sun, give it space, give it time, and eventually it often rewards the gardener with decades of dependable performance. I think Baptisia is a perfect example of what today's video is really about. Not every great perennial makes a strong first impression. Some spend years quietly preparing for a future that is far more impressive than anything they show in the beginning. And Baptisia may be one of the best examples of all. Lavender may be one of the most misunderstood perennials in the garden. People often buy it because it looks beautiful, smells wonderful, and seems easy to grow. But the truth is, young lavender can be surprisingly difficult. In fact, many gardeners struggle with lavender during the first year or two. The reason is simple. Lavender is a plant that prefers independence. It doesn't enjoy constantly wet soil. It doesn't need frequent feeding. And it usually performs best when gardeners resist the urge to help too much. When lavender is newly planted, its roots are still adapting to the surrounding soil. The plant may look small, growth may seem slow, and flowering can be inconsistent. For some gardeners, this creates concern. They water more, they fertilize more, and sometimes they unintentionally create the very conditions lavender dislikes. But once the root system becomes established, lavender often changes dramatically. The plant becomes more resilient, more drought-tolerant, and far less demanding. What once seemed fragile gradually becomes one of the easiest plants in the garden. One reason mature lavender is so valuable is that it often thrives where other plants struggle. Hot summers, dry conditions, poor soil. Situations that stress many garden plants can be surprisingly comfortable for established lavender. That makes it especially useful in low-maintenance landscapes. I've noticed that older lavender plants often develop a confidence that's hard to describe. The shape becomes fuller, the flowering becomes more predictable, and the plant begins fitting naturally into the landscape around it. It no longer looks like a new addition. It looks like it belongs. Of course, lavender still needs the right conditions. Good drainage is critical. Sunlight matters, and overwatering remains one of the most common problems. But once those needs are met, time becomes one of lavender's greatest allies. That's why I think lavender deserves a place on this list. Not because it's the easiest perennial in the beginning, but because it often becomes dramatically easier once it's truly established. And sometimes that's exactly the kind of plant worth waiting for. Some perennials make a dramatic first impression. Coneflowers usually don't, at least not in the way many gardeners expect. When young, coneflowers often appear modest. A few stems, a handful of blooms, and a presence that can easily be overlooked among larger, more established plants. But what makes coneflowers special isn't what they do in the first year. It's what they continue doing year after year. Because unlike some plants that peak early and slowly decline, coneflowers often become stronger as they mature. The clumps expand, the stems become sturdier, and flowering usually becomes more reliable. Part of this improvement comes from root development. As the plant settles into the garden, it becomes better equipped to handle heat, dry periods, and changing weather conditions. What once seemed like an average perennial gradually becomes a dependable performer. And dependability is something every mature garden needs. Another reason gardeners appreciate coneflowers is their versatility. They fit into cottage gardens, pollinator gardens, native plant gardens, and low-maintenance landscapes. Few plants adapt to so many different garden styles so naturally. I've noticed that mature coneflower plantings often feel more relaxed than newly planted ones. The flowers seem more abundant, the spacing feels more natural, and the garden begins developing a rhythm that simply can't be created in a single season. It takes time. And that's exactly the point. Coneflowers also bring life to the garden in ways that go beyond flowers. Bees visit them. Butterflies visit them. And later in the season, seed heads often attract birds as well. So even after blooming slows down, the plants continue contributing to the landscape. Of course, coneflowers are not completely maintenance-free. They still benefit from suitable sunlight and reasonable growing conditions, but compared to many ornamental plants, they ask for surprisingly little once established. And that relationship often improves with age. I think that's why coneflowers have earned such a strong reputation among experienced gardeners, not because they demand attention, but because they quietly become better every year. And sometimes, those are the plants we appreciate most. Some perennials impress us with rare flowers. Others impress us with reliability. And if there is one perennial that has earned a reputation for dependable performance, it may be the daylily. At first, a young daylily often looks fairly ordinary, a small fan of leaves, a modest clump, and not much indication of what it may become a few years later. But daylilies have a habit of improving quietly over time. Each year, the clump grows a little larger, a few more fans appear, a few more flower stalks emerge, and gradually, the plant begins occupying more space in the garden, without demanding much attention. One reason gardeners appreciate daylilies is their consistency. They don't need constant pampering. They don't require perfect soil, and many varieties tolerate heat, drought, and changing weather surprisingly well. That makes them especially valuable in real-world gardens. Not show gardens, not display gardens, but gardens that people actually live with every day. As the years pass, the transformation becomes easier to notice. A single small plant can become a substantial clump. Flower production increases, the garden feels fuller, and bare spaces slowly disappear. What began as a simple perennial starts functioning almost like a permanent feature in the landscape. I think that's one reason daylilies remain popular decade after decade. They reward patience without demanding perfection. Miss a watering occasionally? Most established daylilies recover. Experience a difficult summer? Many continue performing anyway. That kind of resilience creates confidence, and confidence makes gardening more enjoyable. Of course, mature daylily clumps may eventually benefit from division. But unlike many plants that decline quickly, daylilies often provide years of reliable growth before that becomes necessary. And even then, division usually creates more plants rather than problems. I've always liked the honesty of daylilies. They rarely promise dramatic overnight results. Instead, they simply become a little larger, a little stronger, and a little more useful every year. Until one day, you realize they've quietly become one of the hardest working plants in the entire garden. And that's exactly why they belong on this list. If there is one perennial that seems to appreciate being left alone, it may be sedum. In fact, many gardeners discover that the less they fuss over sedum, the better it performs. That can feel surprising at first, especially when the plant is still young. A newly planted sedum often looks small, compact, and sometimes a little underwhelming compared to the larger flowering plants nearby. But sedum is a perennial that rewards patience in a very practical way. As the years pass, the plant gradually becomes tougher. The root system expands. The clump becomes denser, and its ability to tolerate dry conditions improves significantly. What starts as a modest plant slowly develops into a reliable garden performer. One reason sedum improves with age is that mature plants become remarkably efficient. Their thick leaves help store moisture. Their roots become better established, and the entire plant is better prepared to handle periods of drought and summer heat. That resilience is one reason sedum is often recommended for low-maintenance gardens. I've always admired how calm mature sedum appears. While some plants struggle during hot weather, sedum often continues looking composed and healthy. Not dramatic, not demanding, just dependable. And dependability becomes more valuable every year. Another benefit of mature sedum is structure. As the plant expands, it creates attractive mounds of foliage that help organize the garden visually. Later in the season, the flower heads add texture and interest long after many other plants have finished blooming. And even during winter, dried seed heads can continue contributing beauty to the landscape. Of course, sedum still needs appropriate conditions. Good drainage is important. Too much moisture can create problems. An extremely rich soil often produces weaker growth. But compared to many ornamental perennials, sedum asks for surprisingly little. That's why I think sedum represents one of the simplest lessons in gardening. Sometimes success doesn't come from doing more. Sometimes, success comes from choosing the right plant and allowing time to do its work. And few plants demonstrate that idea better than sedum. Year after year, it simply becomes stronger, more stable, and more useful in the garden. Russian sage is one of those plants that can easily confuse new gardeners. When it's young, it often looks thin, sparse, and far less impressive than the photos on the plant tag. You plant it expecting clouds of color and movement. Instead, you may get a small plant that seems to do very little at first. That slow beginning causes many gardeners to underestimate it. But Russian sage is a perennial that rewards patience in a very dramatic way. Because once established, it becomes almost unrecognizable compared to its younger self. The plant grows larger, the branching becomes fuller, and the soft waves of silvery foliage begin creating a completely different presence in the garden. What makes Russian sage so appealing is not just the flowers. It's the overall effect, the movement, the texture, the way it catches light during early morning and late afternoon. A mature planting often feels airy and effortless, almost as if it appeared naturally. One reason Russian sage improves so much with age is its growing confidence in difficult conditions. Heat rarely bothers it. Dry periods become less stressful, and once roots are well established, the plant often thrives with surprisingly little attention. In many gardens, it becomes one of the most dependable performers of late summer. I've noticed that young Russian sage often struggles with expectations. People expect immediate impact, but the real beauty usually arrives later. Not in the first season, sometimes not even in the second. But when the plant finally reaches maturity, the wait begins making sense. Another reason gardeners appreciate mature Russian sage is the way it softens a landscape. It blends beautifully with ornamental grasses, perennials, native plantings, and pollinator gardens. Rather than dominating the space, it helps connect everything around it. Of course, Russian sage still prefers certain conditions. Full sun is important, good drainage matters, and overly rich soil can sometimes reduce performance. But once the plant finds a suitable location, it often becomes remarkably self-sufficient. I think Russian sage teaches a lesson that applies far beyond gardening. Some things reveal their value slowly, not because they're weak, but because they're building towards something larger than a quick first impression. And Russian sage is a wonderful reminder of that idea. One of the challenges of perennial gardening is that plants rarely announce when they're finally becoming established. There isn't a specific day when a perennial suddenly declares, "I'm ready now." Instead, the changes are often subtle, easy to miss, and spread across several seasons. That's why many gardeners learn to look for signs rather than dramatic results, because establishment is usually a process, not a single event. One of the first signs is consistency. A perennial that returns each spring a little stronger than the year before is often telling you that its root system is becoming more secure. The growth may not be spectacular, but it's becoming dependable. Another sign is improved flowering. Not necessarily more flowers overnight, but steadier flowering, more predictable flowering, and blooms that seem less affected by minor weather changes. The plant begins acting less like a newcomer and more like a permanent resident of the garden. Size can also be a clue. Many established perennials gradually become fuller. The clump expands, new shoots appear, and empty spaces begin disappearing. The change is often slow enough that you don't notice it day to day, but comparing photos from several years apart can be surprisingly revealing. I've noticed that mature perennials often develop a different kind of confidence. They recover more quickly after stress, handle dry periods better, and seem less affected by small mistakes. That resilience is often one of the clearest signs that a plant has truly settled into its environment. Of course, every perennial is different. Some establish quickly, others take several years. But the pattern is usually similar: stronger roots, greater stability, more predictable performance, and less dependence on constant attention from the gardener. I think recognizing these signs is important because it helps us appreciate progress that isn't always obvious. Not every success appears as a dramatic burst of flowers. Sometimes success looks like a plant quietly returning year after year, healthier, stronger, and more comfortable in its place. And once you begin noticing those signals, it's easier to trust the process. Which brings us to another important topic: the mistakes that often prevent gardeners from ever reaching this stage. One of the most unfortunate things in perennial gardening is that many good plants are removed long before they ever have a chance to succeed. Not because they're unhealthy, not because they're in the wrong location, but because the gardener simply loses patience. And honestly, that's understandable. We invest time, we invest money, we invest hope. When a plant doesn't respond as quickly as we expected, it's natural to wonder whether something is wrong. But sometimes the biggest mistake isn't poor care, it's expecting results before the plant is ready. One common mistake is moving a perennial too often. A gardener plants it, waits a season, then decides it isn't growing fast enough. So the plant gets moved. And just when the roots begin settling into the new location, it gets moved again. Unfortunately, every move forces the plant to spend energy rebuilding underground instead of progressing forward. Another mistake is comparing young plants to mature gardens. We see beautiful photos online: large hostas, massive peonies, full borders overflowing with flowers. What we don't see are the years that came before those images. The waiting, the setbacks, the gradual development. And without that context, many gardeners assume they're failing when they're actually right on schedule. Overwatering is another common problem, especially with plants like lavender, sedum, and other drought-tolerant perennials. The plant appears slow, the gardener worries, more water is added, and before long, the roots are struggling in conditions they never wanted. The intention is good, the result often isn't. I've also noticed that many gardeners give up too quickly after a difficult season: a harsh summer, an unusually wet spring, a late frost. One challenging year does not always tell us what a perennial is capable of becoming. Sometimes the plant simply needs another season, or two. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: a perennial should not always be judged by what it does in its first year, or even its second. Many of the plants we've discussed today only become impressive after they've had enough time to establish themselves. And once they do, they often exceed expectations. The goal isn't to ignore real problems. Poor drainage matters. Wrong sunlight matters. Plant health matters. But patience matters too. And sometimes the difference between success and disappointment is simply giving a good plant enough time to become what it was meant to be. One of the biggest shifts that happens in gardening comes when we stop thinking in seasons and start thinking in years. At first, most gardeners naturally focus on immediate results. What bloomed this year? What grew the fastest? What looked best this month? And there's nothing wrong with that. After all, gardens are meant to be enjoyed. But over time, many experienced gardeners begin seeing things differently. Instead of asking, "What did this plant do this season?" they start asking, "What direction is this plant moving over several years?" That small change in perspective can transform the entire gardening experience. When we think only in seasons, slow-growing perennials can feel disappointing. Progress seems limited. The garden never feels finished, and patience becomes difficult. But when we think in years, those same plants begin telling a different story. A story of steady improvement, gradual strength, and lasting beauty. I think mature gardens often feel special because they were never built in a hurry. They evolved, one season at a time, one plant at a time, one lesson at a time. And that process leaves its mark on the landscape. The garden gains depth, character, and a sense of permanence that's difficult to create quickly. Many of the perennials we've discussed today reward exactly this kind of long-term thinking. Peonies, hostas, Baptisia, coneflowers, daylilies. They become more valuable with time, not because they suddenly change, but because we allow them enough years to become what they were designed to be. I've noticed that gardeners who enjoy their gardens the most often aren't chasing perfection. They're observing progress. They understand that every season is part of a much larger story, a story that may take years to fully unfold. And somehow, that makes gardening feel less stressful, not slower, just more realistic. Perhaps that's one reason perennial gardening remains so rewarding. It encourages us to think beyond immediate results, to trust processes we cannot always see, and to appreciate improvements that happen gradually. Because in the end, some of the most beautiful parts of a garden aren't created in a single season. They're created through time. And time, more than anything else, is often the gardener's greatest partner. Have you ever visited an older garden and immediately felt that it was different? Not necessarily bigger, not necessarily more expensive, just different. More comfortable, more balanced, more complete. I think much of that feeling comes from time. Because mature gardens are not created all at once. They're shaped gradually through seasons of growth, adjustment, and observation. Plants find their place. Gardeners learn what works. And the landscape slowly develops its own identity. One of the first things people notice in a mature garden is fullness. Empty spaces become smaller. Perennials expand into natural clumps. Layers begin forming between taller and shorter plants. Instead of individual specimens standing alone, the garden starts behaving like a community. And that creates a completely different visual experience. Texture also plays a major role. Young gardens often feel simple because most plants are still developing. But mature gardens contain years of accumulated structure. Large hosta leaves beside fine ornamental grasses. Dense mounds of sedum beside airy Russian sage. Different shapes and forms working together naturally. The result feels rich without feeling crowded. Another difference is stability. In a young garden, every season can feel unpredictable. Plants are still establishing. Spaces are still changing. But mature gardens often develop a rhythm. The gardener knows what to expect. The plants know where they belong. And that confidence becomes visible throughout the landscape. I've always felt that mature gardens tell stories. Not dramatic stories, quiet stories. Stories about patience, observation, and small improvements repeated over many years. Every established perennial represents time invested wisely. Every thriving border reflects seasons of learning. Perhaps that's why mature gardens feel so welcoming. They're not trying to impress anyone. They simply reflect years of growth, years of care, and years of allowing nature to do what it does best. And when we understand that, it becomes easier to appreciate our own gardens exactly where they are today. Because every mature garden we admire was once a young garden waiting for its future to arrive. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I think there's one lesson that stands above all the others. Many of the most rewarding plants in a garden are not the ones that impress us immediately. They're the ones that earn our appreciation slowly, season after season, year after year. Think about the plants we've discussed today. Peonies, hostas, Baptisia, lavender, coneflowers, daylilies, sedum, Russian sage. None of them are at their best on the day they're planted. Their greatest beauty comes later, after roots have developed, after seasons have passed, after patience has done its work. And perhaps that's why mature gardens feel so meaningful. They're living reminders that good things often take time. Not because progress isn't happening, but because some of the most important progress happens where we can't immediately see it. Underground, quietly, one small step at a time. If there's one thing perennial gardening teaches well, it's this. A plant doesn't need to be impressive today to become extraordinary tomorrow. It simply needs the opportunity, the right conditions, and enough time. So if you have a perennial in your garden that seems slow, quiet, or a little disappointing right now, don't be too quick to judge it. You may be looking at a future favorite, a future focal point, a future success story that simply hasn't revealed itself yet. Thank you for spending part of your day here with me. I truly appreciate it. If you enjoy these calm, thoughtful gardening conversations, I'd love to have you join us again. Until next time, take care of yourself and enjoy your garden one season at a time. Goodbye for now, my friends.
Thank you for spending this time in the garden with me. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more quiet, practical gardening insights. I'll see you again in the next one.